Awesome. Okay, well, I will say hello again to everyone officially and welcome you to our event on three new books in the field of embodied social change. We obviously live in highly uncertain and even frightening times, and so I think it's increasingly important for us to be in community and to make space for how these big changes unfolding in the world land in our bodies and for exploration of how personal and affective counter moves might support broader political change. And in their own way, each of the books we're featuring today have bearing on these questions, and we're featuring three excellent books by David McMahan, Shannon Mariotti, and Anita Chari. This is the special effects version of our program today. I'm going to show you these excellent books, Rethinking Meditation by David McMahan and Contemplative Democracy by Shannon Mariotti, and Anita Chari's A User's Manual to Claire Fontaine. So, again, impressive special effects. My name is James Rowe, and I'm at the University of Victoria in Canada. Just to give folks a little bit of backstory in terms of this event and similar events that we've held, myself, Farah Godridge, and Shannon Mariotti have been hosting events such as this since 2019, and this is actually our fourth event, though the organizing team has shifted and is now myself, Anita Chari, and Zara Ahmed. Before 2019, we've been organizing individual panels on mindfulness and politics as part of the Western Political Science Association meetings starting in 2015. We started doing that. And so it's impressive or hard for me to believe that we're a decade now into this collective project of exploring the intersections between and distances between individual and socio-structural transformation. Because of the interdisciplinary nature of this work along the way, we've connected with scholars from many different disciplines, building up an email list of 70 plus folks from political science, religious studies, Africana studies, philosophy, social work, and onwards who are interested in these intersections. And if you would like to be added to our email list, you can send me an email, or you can also pop your email in the chat, and I'll grab it after this session. It's a low traffic email list. Your inbox will not get overwhelmed. Also, just going to start with a territorial acknowledgement. We're using a Zoom link from my university at UVic, and so I'm going to do acknowledgement for where I'm at, and you can do a version of your own in your head. Maybe after I'm done with this, folks can just throw in the chat where they're beaming in from, so we do have a sense of where everyone's coming to us from. The acknowledgement I'm going to share is developed in partnership with the local nations where I live. So we acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanic peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. There's lots of debate around land acknowledgements, their importance, and their limits. When done right, I do think that they are an exemplar of embodied social change. They're rituals that encourage participants in an embodied way to remember where they are and to renew responsibilities to the land and to the people who, in the case of Southern Vancouver Island, where I'm beaming in from, have been in reciprocal relationship with these lands since time immemorial. And obviously, understanding the pre-colonial context of the land we're on is vital to building needed momentum for processes of decolonization. And so if folks are able to just throw where they are beaming in from in the chat, that will just sort of quickly allow us to get a little bit of a sense of all the different places that people are coming in from. Wonderful. Cool. So as folks are doing that, I'm just going to turn to our sort of final orienting element before we get to our first panel. And I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Anita Chari, who's going to lead us in a grounding practice. It would be wrong, borderline criminal to begin an event on embodied social change in the sort of disembodied space of Zoom without some kind of embodiment practice to ground us and help us arrive. And so Dr. Chari is an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon, and also the co-founder of Embodying Your Curriculum, an online training program that helps faculty better bring embodied, trauma-informed, and social justice paradigms into higher education. Anita, of course, is also one of our featured authors today. And so I'll hand it over to you, Anita. Thank you so much for doing this for us.
Thank you so much, James, and thank you all for being here. It's such a pleasure to be able to gather this community of people thinking about issues on embodied social change. So yeah, as James said, because we're online and yet we want to really embody the principles of presence that are so crucial to the work that all of us do. Let's do a grounding practice. So if you could just get comfortable wherever you are, and if it feels comfortable for you, just to take a moment just to close your eyes or soften your eyes and back your attention away from the screen for a moment. We spend a lot of time in this very visual space, and it can really pull our attention. So just taking a moment to really draw your attention back from the screen into your body. And seeing if you can just soften that space between your eyes for a moment and let some horizontal widening happen. And then just taking a moment to notice the movement of breath in your body. Sensing where in your own body you feel the flow and movement of your breath. And then now just taking a moment to sense the rhythm and the tempo of your own system, your own nervous system just now. So even as we're sitting in stillness, there's always movement happening inside of us. Taking a moment to really feel what the pace, the tempo inside of you is. And then now just allowing your attention just to start settling down lower in your body. Allowing it to sink almost just of its own accord down into where your body is making contact with your chair or whatever you're sitting on. And just sensing your sit bones and your pelvis in contact with the surface below you. Feeling the support of the ground beneath your pelvis and sit bones. And just noticing if you can sense one side of your pelvis, one side sit bone more than the other. And then on that side, sensing where you feel the weight of your body on your sit bone. Okay, and then just one more cue before we complete. Just taking a moment to just shift your attention fluidly and slowly from this space of feeling our own bodies to allowing our attention just to come into our collective space. So just dilating our attention just a little bit outside of our own bodies into the shared space. And just sensing whatever it is you sense. And then when you feel ready, just taking a moment to find a place to complete the practice and just opening up your own eyes and coming back into our space. Okay. Thank you, everybody. And I will now turn it over to our panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anita. Lovely. Before moving to the first panel, just want to quickly clarify our schedule. We're going to do the first panel, take a short break, and then launch into our second panel at 10:30 a.m. Pacific. Sorry, I won't do all the conversions. And Shannon, I apologize for missing Central Time. And then after the second panel, we'll take a 30-minute break and then come back for our final panel at 12:30 p.m. Pacific. You're, of course, welcome to come and go as you please. The link that you used to get in should get you back in if you do exit. And just advance apologies if it takes me a while to get you back from the waiting room back in if you come back in. Without further ado, going to turn to our first panel on David McMahan's Rethinking Meditation, Buddhist Meditative Practices in Ancient and Modern Worlds. David is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College in Pennsylvania. And we're going to start the panel hearing from Joanna Cook and then from Seth Segall. Joanna is reader in medical anthropology at University College London and author of the book Meditation in Modern Buddhism, Renunciation and Change in Thai Monastic Life. And Seth is a Zen Buddhist priest and clinical psychologist. Recent books include The House We Live In, Virtue, Wisdom, and Pluralism. And Seth is also a contributing editor to Tricycle, the Buddhist Review. So without further ado, please take it away, Joanna.
Okay. Can everyone hear me all right? Can you all hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Hi, everybody. Hi, guys. Thank you so much for inviting me. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. And it's a pleasure because it's such a nice thing to be able to say nice things about an excellent book written by a scholar whom I deeply admire. David, over the years, it's really funny calling you David. I've referenced you so many times that actually first names feels really sacrilegious somehow. Over the years, your work has had a profound impact on my thinking and has been a huge inspiration to me, both for your careful analysis and also for the depth and the rigor of your scholarship. We've never met, but you may or may not be pleased to know that you've consistently been one of the voices in my head. And of course, this book is no exception. In its reflection on ancient and modern meditation, it presents a persuasive and important account of how meditation is embedded in specific life worlds, ethical projects, and understandings of the self. So for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it yet, and I urge you to do so, David identifies naturalized assumptions that are smuggled into our everyday thinking of the way things are, really unpicking normative assumptions about in the givenness of the everyday. Now, this is really impressive work, and he delineates key values in cultural and intellectual life, both historically and in contemporary practice, and shows how values inform the meaning and the experience of practice itself. Now, I've argued in my own work that who you think you are and what you think you're doing when you practice meditation will really radically inform the experience and the meaning of practice. Now, I've also attempted to trace different histories of Buddhism, most notably the history of Thai monastic practice and the history of British engagement with Buddhism since the 19th century. So David's work is really bang in my wheelhouse, as we say in England. Now, my project shares an affinity with David's work, both in its attention to vernacular understandings of ancient and modern practices, and in its endeavor to explore the meaning, value, and effects of meditation in different historical contexts. Both these objectives, so attention to the cultural value and the historicization of meditation, might seem like really obvious intentions for an anthropologist. But they are especially important, I think, because both Buddhism and meditation are often characterized as timeless, authentic, or culture-free. And this, I think, is why Rethinking Meditation is such a treasure of a book. Rethinking Meditation is in part a genealogical story of how mindfulness and meditation, as we think of them today, what David refers to as the standard version, with a capital S and a capital V, came to be what they are. In this respect, he is attentive to the pushes and the pulls of culture, what he calls the filters and magnets. That is, how practices and perspectives have been filtered out of contemporary practices through generally accepted ideas and background ideologies, and how dominant norms in a given culture attract certain practices and ethical and philosophical ideas. The book is littered with elegant turns of phrase, but one I particularly like that illustrates this point is David's stated aim to, and I quote, examine orientations that are built into the subterranean conceptual architecture of contemporary social imaginaries. It's beautiful. In developing this argument, David argues against the idea of a universal view from nowhere, so that meditation enables a perennialist experience of unmediated universal truth. In this kind of objectivist interpretation, meditation enables the transcendence of cultural condition to achieve a form of pristine insight into unmediated transcultural knowledge. But of course, it is a deep irony of modern meditation that the idea that meditation enables the transcendence of cultural conditioning is itself informed by post-Enlightenment cultural values. And what David does so beautifully in this book is to show that meditation practices are deeply interwoven with specific concepts, expectations, and affective inclinations. Now, in this respect, I think while David has done a tremendous service to the history of religion, this book is grounded in a well-developed and impressive anthropological sensibility. It is committed to exploring the relationship between meditative practice and cultural context. And David shows that meditation is deeply shaped by the web of ideas and values that surround practice, and that culture is central to the work that meditation does in particular social contexts. But if one arm of David's analysis is constructivist, the other arm is deconstructivist. He shows that meditation is also powerful because it enables the dismantling of attitudes, virtues, ideas, emotions, ways of thinking, and so on. So far from a deterministic picture of meditators as wholly conditioned by the cultural contexts in which they find themselves, David shows that the power of meditative experience often rests on a form of radical critical interrogation of personal and cultural assumptions. In so doing, he's not dismissing the powerful self-transcending and self-forming experiences that people have through meditation. Far from it, his analysis is deeply respectful of the power and impact of meditative experience. And he provides a powerful meditation, if I might use the word in that way, on the cultivation of ethical orientations, values, capacities, and dispositions, and the embodiment of particular modes of being in the world. Adaptations of meditation reveal what we take for granted about the context in which we are embedded, our anxieties, fears, aspirations, and David delineates the refraction of meditation through the lenses of specific cultural values. He takes appreciation, authenticity, autonomy, and interdependence to be central. So, appreciation. Contemporary meditation is less about transcendence of the world and more about the wonder of life itself. So the wondrous reality of washing the dishes to do the dishes, as Thich Nhat Hanh puts it, reflects what Charles Taylor describes as the sacralization of the everyday, or the sacralization of the present moment. The sense that we may develop an appreciation of the extraordinary ordinary. Authenticity and autonomy reflect the fact that in contemporary iterations of meditation, the freedom of the subject is often linked to liberation from social conditioning. The autonomous self is one who follows their own authentic inner wisdom as verified through meditation, as opposed to the formality of convention. And on this, I wasn't going to say this, but I'll say it. I come from quite a meditation-heavy world. And so a member of my family once told me that they said, "I'd just like to see how I am with a bigger TV." And so yes, so I think this idea of authenticity is kind of bang on the money. Finally, interdependence highlights a prevalent recognition of the interconnectedness of all things, often linking up meditative practices with ethical and social responsibility. Now, David understands each of these as an ethic, a constellation of concepts, values, and ideals through which contemporary meditators interpret themselves and the world, but also that carries implicit directives about how to act in the world. They are part of the background landscape of ideas and values prevalent in late modern liberal democracies. Now, this is like catnip for me. I've spent the best part of my career thinking about meditation in terms of culture, self-cultivation, and ethics. And David's account is masterful, both for the broad sweep of its range and also for the detail of its analysis. David highlights the recent development of a model of autonomy as situated. That is, freedom and ethical agency are embedded in social contexts and systematically intertwined with other individuals, social institutions, political structures, and so on. And he contrasts this to a model of autonomy as an interior space of invulnerability to external influence. He argues that, and I quote him, "the situated autonomy model makes more sense of how meditation actually works in lives embedded in particular contingent contexts." So that is, as an analytic framework, it allows the anthropologist/historian to understand the relationship between practices, ethics, values, life worlds, and so on. But he also argues that the situated autonomy model is an orientation for meditators themselves, allowing them to, and I quote him again, "expand the deployments of the practice to a wide array of activities, personal, social, and political." Now, I found this really interesting, that a model of autonomy might be both an analytic tool and an ethnographic fact. Because, of course, as David systematically demonstrates throughout Rethinking Meditation, meditation is always embedded in particular social and cultural contexts. So it feels fitting then that David concludes the book on a hopeful note. In the high modern flux of liquid life, characterized by precarity, disorientation, fragmentation, and unstable identity. The situated autonomy model of meditation offers the possibility not only of re-enchanting the world, but also may, in his words, and this is the quote that I want to end on, contribute to the transformation of the Anthropocene into a more livable age. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joe. Gonna turn things over now to Seth.
Well, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay, I don't think I have anything to say now after listening to Joe. So that was wonderful, Joe. And David, it's wonderful to see you. And also, I want to just pay you the debt that Joe paid you, that your first book on the making of Buddhist modernism is probably the best book in this century, I think, about contemporary Buddhism. And I think this book on meditation is a wonderful follow-up to it and addresses a question that's always been very interesting to me. So I'm the only non-academic, I think, that's going to be speaking today. So I want to situate myself first. I'm a Zen Buddhist priest, and I'm going to be talking about what I think David's book means for practitioners like myself. I'll add that while I'm a ordained Zen Buddhist priest in an ancient lineage, I'm also a Buddhist modernist par excellence. I'm an advocate for a Buddhism that's naturalized and pragmatic and eudaimonic and cosmopolitan. And my meditation practice, when I look at the teachers I've had over the last 3 decades, they've been people unbound by orthodoxies. So I think about people like Tony Packer or John Kabat-Zinn or Linda Madaro or writers like Stephen Batchelor and Barry Magid, and they've really informed a lot of where I'm coming from. My own practice, my own meditation practice leans towards open monitoring practice. I believe in meditation that opens the net as wide as possible without preconceived ideas about what we might discover while meditating. Or as we say in Zen, not knowing is most intimate. And I think David's book gives people like me permission to adapt Buddhist practices in ways that make the most sense given our aims and intentions, which doesn't mean we abandon tradition, because tradition is always there to be consulted, but it also means we don't feel bound by it. So I'll begin by noting, just as David does, that meditation is not a single thing. There isn't even a word for meditation in Sanskrit. We usually use the word bhavana, which means cultivation. There are a wide variety of cultivation practices beyond focused attention and open monitoring. There's analytic meditations, meditations to cultivate wholesome mental states, meditations to experience non-duality, meditations to manipulate subtle body energies, or to meditate to manipulate seed syllables in Sanskrit, or to visualize deities and their practices. Just a wide variety of things that get called meditation. And what they have in common is that they're all methods for cultivating a variety of mental states and a variety of experiences that are believed to be helpful in terms of making progress in the Buddhist path. And as David also emphasizes, these meditation practices are not the timeless practices handed down since the time of the Buddha, that as you go century by century by century, you see shifts and changes in the way these meditations are both practiced and understood. So just to give a few small examples, we can say that modern Vipassana meditation, for example, is a 19th century invention by Lady Sayadaw that kind of nods back to the Visuddhimagga in terms of where it comes from, but it's designed for lay people. So it does away with the jhanas and the arupas, and it's meant to be an easy practice for lay people to do. And we can say the same thing about, and we can also note that before Vipassana, Kate Crosby has done this wonderful work that David nods to, that the Boron Kamatana meditation that people did back then is absolutely almost uninterpretable by modern practitioners. It relies on having lived in a world that's steeped in Tantra and alchemy and Ayurveda and occult understandings of word syllables and the subtle anatomy. It involves shifting energy in various places along the body, along some preconceived path, along with using certain sacred syllables, with the intention of growing a Buddha, a baby Buddha in your abdomen. And when you think about that kind of practice, it's not something that makes any sense to most modern people anymore. On the other hand, when S.N. Goenka comes ahead and says, well, this practice is really the science of mind, he's created a framework that makes Westerners feel very comfortable in going ahead and indulging in the practice. And we could say the same thing about Zen practice. the kind of Zen practice that we do today in the United States, and I assume in Japan too, is largely the result of homeless Kodo, who early in the 20th century went up and down the length of Japan, teaching lay people how to meditate, which is something that was never done before. And we can ask, is this kind of practice that Kodo kind of transmitted to Japan, is that the same practice that the ancient Tang Chan masters engaged in? And the answer is we don't know. The Chan masters never wrote down meditation manuals in the Tang dynasty. Come into the Song dynasty and you begin to have descriptions of silent illumination or the Huato method of doing koans. But then when we come to, say, Dogen, who is the 13th century Zen master who is really a spiritual heir to a lot of contemporary Zen, he talks about meditation as the dropping off of body and mind. What does he mean by that? When I meditate, my body and mind don't drop away. In fact, I'm in more intimate contact with them. What did he mean by that? And it's very hard to know what he meant by that. I don't think anyone really does. I mean, we can come up with interpretations. You're doing away with conceptions of body and mind and getting in touch with the real thing, or maybe he's talking about something like Thomas Messenger's minimal phenomenal experience, but I don't think that's what he's talking about. And some people have suggested that in coming up with that phrase, dropping off body and mind, he was really misunderstanding what his teacher Ru Jing said, because his auditory understanding of Chinese wasn't all that great. That maybe Ru Jing instead said wiping dust off the body and mind, which sounds in Chinese very much like dropping off the body and mind. But at any rate, we don't know how much of what we're doing right now is a timeless practice that goes back forever, or is something new that we're doing today. And I think David is very good at showing how in different cultures we repurpose medication for different aims. So for example, he talks about how ancient Indian monastics contemplated the foulness of the body, how it was filled with pus and blood and bile and phlegm and feces. They would observe dead bodies decomposing, all for the idea of detaching from the body and disenchanting themselves from the body, disidentifying from the body. Whereas today, we all practice the body scan because we want to become more intimate with our bodies and experience them more fully. So again, it's just amazing how much these practices can change over time. And David also dismantles the idea that meditation is a science of the mind that enables practitioners to discover the way things really are. And of course, there is no way things really are for limited beings such as ourselves. There's only how they reveal themselves to us in any given moment, given our histories, our projects, and our intentions. And I think here of von Uxkall's work on the Umwelt as an example of that. He used the example of a forest and the trees in the forest and 4 different people going into that forest. And imagine a lumberjack and an ecologist and 2 lovers on a tryst and a little lost boy in a forest, and how different the forest appears, right? For the lumberjack, the forest is just so many yards of lumber. And for the ecologist, the trees are homes for insects and birds and squirrels. And for the lovers, it's just a lovely bower to enclose themselves and so on. And for the little lost boy, he maybe sees the branches of the trees as fingers coming out to ensnare him in some kind of way. But the forest reveals itself differently for different people depending on their situations. So if you're a Theravadan, when you meditate, you discover suffering and impermanence and not self. And if you're Madhyamaka, you discover emptiness and interdependence. And if you're a Zeni like me, you discover intimacy with the present moment. But we're really constrained in many ways by what we discover by the traditions we practice in. And while David recognizes the deconstructive potential of meditation, kind of going back to the kinds of possibilities suggested by Nagarjuna's Tetralemma or the Zen admonition to go beyond words and letters, David also recognizes that even when we're encouraged to transcend our mental categories, we're still limited by our social imaginaries, by our habits and conditioning, and by the constraining visions of our traditions. Okay, in the final part of his book, David explores the ethics of appreciation, authenticity, and autonomy, and how they influence contemporary Buddhist practice. And of course, we see the ethics of appreciation in the work at work in mindfulness meditation's emphasis on the pleasures of embodiment, of savoring, of stopping to smell the roses, and as Joe mentioned, discovering the sacred and mundane tasks. We see it reflected in the title of Mayazumi Roshi's classic book, Appreciate Your Life, the Essence of Zen Practice. Okay, but we also recognize this absence of appreciation is totally absent in Indian early Buddhism, although it characterizes a lot of East Asian and Western Buddhism. Okay, the ethic of authenticity is the idea that we have an authentic self that requires uncovering, actualization, and expression, and that meditation involves going within to discover that self. And of course, we note that in early Indian Buddhism, there was no such thing as an essential or unchanging self. And in the Ethic of Autonomy, David invokes Charles Taylor's buffered self, the self that is self-determining, individuated, and an independent rational control over its appetites and emotions, one that is unperturbed by untoward life circumstances. And this is reflected in the idea that meditation builds equanimity and peace regardless of external circumstances, and that we're all responsible for our own happiness. And again, he suggests that we replace this with a situated self, a conception that simultaneously acknowledges our social embeddedness and our ability to enhance our agency through increased awareness. This buffered self conflicts with postmodernist views of the self as contingent, dialogical, and interdependent, and is also a perspective that is more consonant with traditional Buddhist views on non-self, dependent origination and emptiness. This interdependent self implies an ethic of care towards all beings and an engaged Buddhism that's more about doing good than just feeling good. Although, as David points out, this contemporary view of interdependence is a secularized one. It's about aiming at a better world in this life, rather than in a future life or through attaining nirvana. I want to take just a moment to focus on two themes that David touches on, but doesn't separate out from the three ethics. And the first is comments on alienation, which he subsumes under the ethic of authenticity, which I think really deserves its own category. Searching for authenticity feels like a separate issue than seeking regrounding in the social and natural world after the development of Western individualism. In his discussion of authenticity, David talks about the discontent with modernity that's evolved in the wake of urbanization, the Industrial Revolution, capitalism, the managerial revolution, consumer culture, secularization, the scientific revolution, and the fall of the aristocracy and rise of the bourgeoisie. So this is a theme of alienation and estrangement that looms large in the work of the Romantics, in the work of Marx and Weber, and in the contemporary existentialists. I just want to remark on something. When you read Erich Fromm's chapter in the book Zen and Psychoanalysis they wrote in 1960, it constitutes a radical break from all the earlier psychological literature on Buddhism. You read Jung on Zen or Tibetan Buddhism, and he sounds like he's speaking to us from an ancient era. You read Fromm, and all of a sudden the language seems fresh, and you feel like it could have been written today. And that's a really remarkable thing. And Erich Fromm's views and his language about talking about things is something that was handed down to humanistic and transpersonal psychology. And it's also been transmitted to Western Buddhism at large, especially the more psychologized convert communities, Buddhist communities. But in this book, he says that the main role of humanistic psychoanalysis, as he calls it, and of Zen practice is to undo the alienation from self, from the world, natural world, and from society. So he sees this practice as a way of undoing some of the effects, or at least compensating for some of the effects of Western individualism. So this is a theme that resonates with the idea of non-duality and interdependence and intimacy. In the Zen community, you often hear people say that Dogen said that enlightenment is intimacy with all things, something which Dogen never said, but it reflects a kind of repurposing of Dogen for modernity. The second theme that I want to mention is that Buddhism has an inherent critique of contemporary social values built within it, and that the Western Buddhist convert communities that arose in the 1960s and 70s were very highly critical of American social and political values prior to their discovery of Buddhism. I'm thinking here of the Beat Generation, of writers like Erich Fromm, who not only wrote Zen and Psychoanalysis, but also wrote The Sane Society, of the psychedelic advocates like Huxley and Watts and Ram Dass and so forth. And they found a welcoming home in Buddhism's message of non-greed, contentment with what one already has, dropping out rather than pursuing social status, and cooperation rather than competitiveness. And I think this is a theme that still resonates with converse Buddhist practitioners today. And it's also a theme that dovetails in an interesting way with David's ethic of authenticity. This idea that we can discover some kind of true self or inner Buddha nature, or maybe Rousseau's noble savage within us that's untouched by social contamination. But there's a wish to kind of separate ourselves from the social values and kind of discover values that express more of what's meaningful to us today. Pointing out that contemporary Buddhist practice is not the timeless practice handed down from the Buddha is in no way a criticism of contemporary practice. practices do and must change to meet the needs of particular times and places. My own 3 decades of meditative practice, first within the insight meditation tradition and then within the Zen tradition, have been enormously valuable to me in many ways, in ways that more traditional practices in pre-modern contexts never could have been. We can't and shouldn't go back to a new traditionalism. What David's book does do is remind us to be more honest and more culturally aware, and to think more clearly about what we're doing when we meditate. It's a rich, nuanced, and well-argued book that makes a great contribution to that end. So thank you, David.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Seth. And so, yeah, now, David, we'll just hand things over to you to sort of riff on some of the comments from Joe and Seth, but also just any other things you would like to share about this wonderful book that you've produced.
Thank you so much. And I'm truly honored by both of you being here and taking the time to dig into the book. Yeah, you're both really interesting writers, and I've enjoyed your work so much. One of the things that sort of stands out, we talked about, it's weird. As you guys were talking, I was thinking, oh, I've had my head in my response to Shannon's book, and so I had to sort of adjust, like, oh, okay, we're talking about my book now. I should think about this, right? I have a bad habit, actually. It's a terrible habit for a writer and an academic. Just when I write something, I tend to sort of then put it aside, and it's published. I've said what I have to say about it, and then I have to sort of think my way back into it. So your summary, Joe, was very helpful to remind me of what I said in this book. I was also reminded of the fact that one of the things, in this book that I've explored is just the degree to which our background assumptions and background ideas and just taken for grantedness, and this is something that Shannon also very much explores in her book, that we're so deeply embedded in that it's really hard to see outside of it. And so when I was exploring this issue in relation to meditation, I came across Joe's anthropological study where she spends over a year, I believe it was, in a Thai monastery, taking vows and really diving into practice. And just the little bit that really sticks with me years later after reading it was the fact that you were kind of horrified to realize that there was a prohibition on exercise. And you were, like athletic and surfed and stuff like that. And I could imagine this in my own life. Just the idea that you couldn't exercise because that was valuing the body too much. And even if and also there was nourishment and, there were food issues. And even if you were injured in this year that you spent in the monastery, that's okay. It's just the body. And that seems so foreign to probably all of us here in some way, because it's almost a kind of sacred value, taking care of yourself for the educated elite, I guess, and nurturing the body and nurturing your health and things like that. So that was one of these moments where I thought, wow, okay, meditation really serves to construct different types of being in the world. And sometimes in a lot of popular meditation literature, that is glossed over completely and lost. So that was one of the inspirations for me to dive into this exploration of, what uses is meditation put to in the modern world? What uses were they put to in the ancient world? How do we expand our imaginations to try and understand and bridge the gaps between those differences, and do so in a way with anthropological curiosity rather than a kind of, you know, lens of, well, my Buddhism or my meditation is the right way to do it, or the opposite, like all modern forms of meditation are just McMindfulness, and the ancient folks were the ones who really knew how to do it. So, um, and I think that's one of the issues that is sort of fraught today still. I came across a video out of the blue on YouTube where a contemporary American teacher was holding up my book, the previous book, The Making of Buddhist Modernism. And he, I just saw this still with him holding my book, and I thought, well, okay, well, I'll see what he has to say. And it seems that people were using my book to accuse him of being a Buddhist modernist. And I didn't really think it was a bad thing or a good thing to be a Buddhist modernist or something to accuse somebody of, but it actually has been sort of a fraught issue in some practice communities where some people say, oh, you're just a kind of modernist, you're not really doing the authentic stuff that's prescribed in this or that tradition or this or that text. Um, or you can have the opposite approach where, you know, we're going to set aside all the kind of metaphysical stuff and the superstitious stuff, and we're going to really get to the essence of what Buddhism was really about. And I think that's kind of a mistake too, because as the Buddha himself said, there are no real essences, and these things have been nebulous, sort of moving constellations of ideas and feelings and practices that have moved in a very haphazard way towards us in the modern world. And so I've never really been too interested in trying to determine which is the best form or the most authentic form of Buddhism or of meditation, even though I do recognize that some scholars, you know, believe that using the language of Buddhist modernism almost inevitably calls forth those judgments of authenticity and unauthenticity. This issue that Seth brought up too of alienation, yeah, I think it's really crucial to understanding how Buddhism has taken shape in the West and how this sense of dislocation, uh, discontent with urbanization, with the suburban sort of model of life, and the critique of contemporary society, which very much was embedded in the counterculture, the beat movement, the converts to American forms of Buddhism. And I think what's interesting is that, you know, alienation implies a kind of homelessness, right? And a, a discomfort with homelessness. And I think that is very much related, as I think Seth mentioned, to individualism, modern individualism. And so I had this discussion actually in my class recently, and it had to do with the meditations on compassion. Uh, it shows up in several places. Buddhaghosa is the most prominent one, where you begin with sort of compassion or loving kindness towards yourself, and then you extend that out towards a person you love, and then a person you sort of neutral towards, and then to enemies. We probably are all familiar with that. Um, but I noticed when my students were talking about it, they were sort of getting hung up a little bit on the self-love part of it. Like that's really what we need in this world is more self-love. And I thought that's interesting, you know. Uh, and and another one brought up this. I, I think it's out there on a video or something. It's also become a very prominent sort of modern Buddhist meme, and I believe it's an incident where the Dalai Lama was giving a talk, and there was a question and answer, and somebody asked him about the problem of self-hatred. And if I remember right, he was sort of saying, what? Self-hatred? He didn't quite get the idea, and he's consulting with his translator and yeah, self-hatred. And finally he gets it, and he seems really kind of stricken by it. And understandably from a Buddhist perspective, because with that meditation, I think the general view is you do have to start with yourself. But I was thinking about the fact that I think the the Buddhist idea is that we just kind of naturally have that. We all care about ourselves. We're all going to step back when the bus is heading towards us. We all want to be happy and not miserable. So that's a kind of given. And the challenge is to take that sort of selfish loving kindness towards yourself and extending it to others. And now it seems like it's no longer a given. And that seems to be an inherent part of this individualistic modern milieu. It's funny. We were talking in a little group I get together with to sit. One of whom is a Tibetan who lives in the U.S. now. Um, we were talking when he wasn't there once. I said, we ought to try that on Jigme to see if he can make sense of the idea of self-hatred. And so next time we saw him, we said, so Jigme, do you have any problem with like self-hatred? And he says, what? And again, he's doing the same thing the Dalai Lama did. It's like, what? And he says, oh no, I try to love everybody. No, 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 no. Self-hatred. And finally, when he gets it, he's just like, oh no, I don't have that. So I think the romanticized answer to that is, oh, well, there's something kind of special about the Tibetans or something, and they're these sort of exotic, enlightened beings. But I think it's that really he grew up, and many people outside of the kind of Western contemporary sphere grew up not feeling like you have to construct yourself, from ground up as an individual. And that burden of individualism really puts a heavy, it takes a heavy toll. This idea that I really have to make all my decisions myself. I have to be authentic to who I really am. And then you're kind of wondering, well, who am I really? I don't know. And you're supposed to have an answer to that, right? So, all these things really, I see this in my students, how they struggle with just this kind of basic sense of who am I? What am I supposed to be? They're suspicious of what society is telling them, but they don't really have a solid answer that's an alternative. So uh, Buddhism, in some of the Perfection of Wisdom texts, talks about this issue of homelessness. The Bodhisattva is described as someone who has no home. He's not here nor there, and that is seen as a sense of freedom. So there may be a kind of Buddhist spin on alienation, on that sense of unease and not at homeness that modern alienation seems to provide us with. That might be interesting to explore. And I think it's the same with, I talk about this a little bit in the last chapter of the book, the idea of non-self. We've had so much emphasis over the past 300 years that we are these isolated individuals, and that has its own kind of burden. And to cultivate a sense of a more porous self, a more fluid self, I think can feel liberating, particularly in relation to people who have been raised in a very individualistic milieu. So that's one of the things I'm sort of interested in exploring. And yeah, I thank you both for sort of evoking those issues. Is there anything else you want to talk about? I don't know.
Well, maybe before we open it up to the audience, broader audience, I don't know if Seth and Joe have any sort of follow-ups, or maybe just like a little back and forth with the panel here.
Seth, did you have any other thoughts?
It's interesting what you brought up because I'm actually beginning an article for Tricycle on that feeling of homelessness because so many liberals in the United States today, for example, feel like, what happened to the country I used to belong to? It seems to have disappeared. Where did it go? And I realized that right-wing conservative Christians have had that same feeling all along. Where's the country I used to belong to? So I think that's a kind of common feeling among many groups today, that the thing I grew up in, that structure I always assumed was going to be there, is dissolved. As Mark said, in our contemporary time, everything dissolves into air, all these structures. Social change is so rapid and people feel like the rub is full. So the question is, we talk about that homelessness, that alienation is bad, but is there a kind of homelessness where you accept that that's the way the world is, that the world is always changing, that you can't hold on to anything, and that can be somehow okay? And that's just a question.
Yeah.
I had a couple of thoughts about as you were speaking. So one is the piece about the kind of authenticity, ethic of authenticity. So on the one hand, you spend you kind of spend most time looking at this kind of internal authenticity, but then you briefly touch on this question about authenticity as a kind of legitimating practice. People want to know that they've got the real deal, and I have a couple of years ago published a book about mindfulness in the UK. So I did an ethnography of mindfulness and mental health in the UK. And what was very striking about the presentation of mindfulness was there was all this stuff about mindfulness as scientific, the science of the mind, and scientifically verified, but it was always coupled with the refrain of this being part of a 2,500-year-old lineage. And it really mattered, so there's a sense in which the kind of authenticity of the practice, that this kind of even though it's being developed as an intervention on the NHS, or it's being discussed in Parliament, and so in so many ways is very secular, committedly secular. So at the same time, this kind of the question of authenticity remains significant and remains a complicated one, and I found that fascinating. And the other thing that I was thinking about as you were speaking was this question of self-hate and self-love. And in the UK, a large part of the way that mindfulness became part of the zeitgeist and was discussed in Parliament and was, on the NHS, was because of the development of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is, for those of you who don't know, it's a group-based psychosocial intervention for the treatment of recurrent depressive episode and chronic anxiety. And you normally do an MBCT course when you're currently well. So those people who have had 3 or more depressive episodes but who are currently well are very vulnerable to relapse. So they do this practice-based work that provides them with tools so that the next time the kind of quiet rumblings of depression are heard, they have tools to be able to help them. And of course, self-love and self-hate become really important then when you're thinking about something like recurrent depression, because the people who experience recurrent depression tend not to have a friendly voice in their head, right? Like if you have a history of depression, you don't often look in the mirror and think you look great this morning. Like it's like that relationship is quite challenging. And so in my analysis of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, I found 3 different kinds of training. So on the one hand, people learn there's a cognitive component. They learn the cognitive framework for depressive relapse, for example. They learn how to, the kind of logic of this these practices, there's also a metacognitive component. So you're learning to develop a decentered perspective on your thoughts, to witness them as thoughts, as clouds in the sky, or various different other metaphors to kind of account for that shift. But the third is this attitudinal training as well. And that is kind of characterized in the MBCT literature as a kind of a friendly curiosity. So are you able to develop this metacognitive stance, this decentered perspective on yourself in a way that is compassionate? So I don't know if this reference will make sense to you guys, but in the UK, there's a naturalist commentator called David Attenborough, who's very famous. He's got this like breathy enunciation, and he's a national treasure. And one MBCT teacher said to me, you know, can you be more like David Attenborough with the gorillas than a sniper with a gun? You know, can you have this friendly curiosity? And so for a lot of MBCT practitioners, this idea of David Attenborough attitude is like a key part to how you begin to train a form of relationship with the self that is not kind of conditioned by the kinds of automatic negative thinking patterns that are associated with relapse. So yes, that's just to say that I think this question about self-love and self-hate actually is really central. And I think it's part, you know, I like, as you know, David, like the history of, for example, British engagement with Buddhism and with meditation is long. Like, it's not like MBCT just came along and developed a link between psychology and Buddhism. Like, we've been figuring Buddhism in a psychological register since at least the 1890s. Like, there's this very beautiful and complicated history. But I think that one of the things that's really key about the popularity of mindfulness and the ways in which people are engaging with mindfulness and meditation at the moment is really this piece around mental health, and that piece about how you can relate to yourself differently. And of course, because MBCT is something that's normally engaged with when you're not in an acute phase of illness, it has this kind of transversal implication. So it's not just for people who would be diagnosable. It's as relevant for politicians as it is for constituents, for psychologists as it is for patients, for probation workers, as for prisoners. And so you have this huge shift in how people think about the nature of well-being, the nature of the mind. And I think that mindfulness provides a window onto that that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I'm definitely going to install David Attenborough's voice in my mind. That's great too.
Lovely.
Yeah, I think to the first point too, the sort of configuration of secular mindfulness may be a little bit different. I'm not really sure how it is in Britain and what the laws are, but I think John Kabat-Zinn's version of mindfulness, his mindfulness-based stress reduction, was in some ways shaped by secularism, not just as a kind of general atmosphere, but by actual secular laws, because here we're not allowed to teach religious things from a religious point of view in public schools, whether they're colleges or elementary schools or anything. Um, so, his solution to that was to strip away all the Buddhist language. And I think there's probably a little bit less of the sense that you're talking about in the United States about, we're part of this long tradition. I know that there are a lot of MBSR teachers who have no idea where this stuff comes from. And, they just they just think it's a part of a modern psychological intervention. They may have some vague idea that it comes from some, Asian traditions. But I think that was carefully crafted, and in some ways it was brilliant. In some ways it's a little problematic, and it's create, there are some problems around it now. There have been lawsuits filed by people who believe that their kids might accidentally have a kind of Buddhist experience, even though they're strong Christians. And the lawsuits have kind of gone both ways about both meditation and yoga. So I think generally in the US, it's woven itself into the fabric of mainstream culture quite a great deal. I always take my students through a few meditative exercises in my classes, and uh, I'm always surprised when I ask how many people have experienced some meditation before. The majority have by the time they've gotten to college. And for some it's been in athletics, for some it's been in counseling, psychology, for some it's just been, a teacher in one of their classes. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a really crazy new chapter in the long, winding history of meditative practices. We've never had practices just sort of hit the fan and go in all different directions like this. And I tend to not be super pessimistic about it. I know there's definitely some validity to the mindfulness critique, but as I heard Norman Fisher say once about watered down Buddhism, he said something like, well, at least it's not watered down fascism. It'll probably have a generally good effect if it's just a little bit in the water, and so.
Great. Thank you so much. Such a generative conversation. So maybe now we'll open things up a little bit for some questions from the broader audience. And so folks want to ask questions. You'll see your React button down in Zoom there. There's a hand raising function, and that's probably the most orderly way to do things. And so if you want to do that, I can call on folks. So I'm seeing that Olga has raised her hand. So Olga, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Yes, this is just a really interesting book. And I have a friend named Daisy who's Buddhist. And I'm actually thinking, because it sounds so good, that in the future sometime for her birthday at Christmas, I'll send you a book to her. Where can you find this book? On Amazon or something?
Yeah, the usual places. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Olga.
I think Shannon's got her hand
Oh,
up.
yeah.
Oh, so I'm sorry. I missed that. Go for
No,
it.
thank you. I couldn't figure out how to raise my hand, so I did it the analog way. I was gonna just jump on the memorable line that David just said about, like, at least they're not watering down fascism. That, like, one of the interviews that I did for my project that has always stuck with me, it's like the best line from the interviews, is someone was saying, like, I don't see why everybody's worrying about mindfulness being everywhere. Like, if they're selling you something, at least they're selling you something that's not Cheetos, right? It's like, it's better than Cheetos. And I was like, that's kind of the spirit that I often come back to that, right? I think at least they're not selling you Cheetos, and now I'll be like, at least they're not watering down fascism. Both are better.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think especially academics or serious practitioners who have really dived into the tradition and appreciate the depths of it, they're taken aback when people have a kind of superficial approach to it. And I was having a conversation with a well-known and very critical Buddhist study scholar, and I said, if you sent a student of yours to, say, Japan and to study Buddhism, and they came back and they said, "Oh my gosh, you wouldn't believe it's so trivial. You've got monks doing astrology charts and people just praying in front of statues of the Buddha and praying for good grades on their exams and stuff like that." And you wouldn't let him get away with that. You'd want him to have some anthropological perspective, and you'd want him to have some respect for the tradition. But when the next door neighbor is having a sort of Buddhism light experience, he's ready to punch him out. So I think it's a dynamic that emerges with people who are really, have really appreciated the depths of the tradition, and they see the tradition being appropriated in a sort of trivial way. But that's just kind of what always happens, right? When I take my car to my car mechanic, I know he's a Christian, but I'm not going to sit down and have a conversation about St. Augustine with him. He's just, he's a superficial Christian, and that's fine. So it's okay, I guess, to be a Buddhist light.
So I saw Howard and then Anita. Nope. Howard, I think you might be, if you are speaking, you're muted still.
Thank you. I love the program. And naturally, what I'm going to say is going to reflect my social and cultural milieu. But I would like to share my take on how meditation has informed my sense of reality and truth. Borrowing from old concepts like non-self, dependent origination, and marrying that to things like neurological studies, scans of the brain activity, social psychology, evolutionary psychology, cognitive psychology, even a Disney movie with looking at what happens inside your brain. I feel like I am closer to reality and truth than I was before, and that other periods of Buddhist meditation have led me to believe they were. And I wonder what your take on that is. How close are we to reality and truth? And is this just another period, or is this different? Thank you.
That's what's called a big question. Yeah. I mean, I actually kind of do think that we do move towards more reality and truth, and we have been historically. I mean, if we look at what we thought the universe was 3,000 years ago or so, versus what we think it is now, I don't think there's a view from nowhere, and I think it's unlikely that we ever get a complete, total vision of what is, of reality with a capital R. I mean, we're human beings, If my cat walks in here and like nuzzles up against my collected works of Plato, he's going to have a particular experience of that book. He's going to smell it, and maybe you can tell who's been thumbing through it or something like that. But he's never going to really appreciate what's inside the pages. And similarly, we have to assume that human beings have similar constraints on our capacities. And I don't know if we've met those constraints quite yet. Maybe we keep on going. But one of the things that I find interesting is that the more we uncover about the nature of things, the more counterintuitive to our experience it often is. Like we experience the sun going around the planet, and we know that actually it doesn't. It's the planet going around the sun. And we experience the table as being a solid thing, but now we know it's actually mostly space. And so as we get closer and closer to reality gets weirder and weirder. And I don't think it's ever going to turn out that it perfectly matches up with any of our historical, religious, or philosophical traditions. It's not, if we ever get to capital R reality, it's not going to probably just match up with like 16th century Greek Orthodoxy or something like that. It's going to be something that's just hard for us to imagine. And so I think that's kind of fun and cool, and it keeps me from being too dogmatic about what we know. But at the same time, I think there is some progress towards particular elements of reality.
All right, thank you. Anita.
Thank you so much for this conversation. It's really rich, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I guess I just had a question that was touching on this point that the comment David, that you made about, and that Shannon picked up on with the watered down fascism. Because, I think about this a lot in terms of like, as a practitioner too, that in a way, yes, it's not watered down fascism, right? And yet I think that there's this question of how practices feed into bigger cultural dynamics. And so, I think about, and I appreciate the pluralistic spirit of this conversation, yet I often think about how, how meditative practices, let's say, how Buddhist practices can also contribute to certain modes of subjectivity that, that may be resistant in certain ways to, and probably we'll be talking about this in the next panel a lot with Shannon's book, but, that can be resistant to forms of political domination, right? And then in other ways that can reinforce certain modes of like solipsism or kind of biopolitical notions of self-care, so I guess, I mean, in a way it's a comment more than anything else, but I do think in a way it's, in that sense, it's important for us to think about the kind of discursive deployments and contexts of how practices are used, because even though it's not watered down fascism, I think what we see in fascism is that a certain mode of subjectivity might prevail, right? Like that we can meditate in fascist societies, right? Probably we'll need to meditate a lot more, actually, is something I've been thinking about. And yet, it's not going to be enough, right? So I don't know if that's clear, but just I think this understanding of how discourses about practices, meditative practices, fit into these broader political formations.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important, and I don't mean to be too cavalier about different ways that Buddhism can be deployed and appropriated in different contexts that might be destructive. I mean, there are versions of Buddhism, for instance, or interpretations that can be, very solipsistic, very sort of, pull yourself up by your own karmic bootstraps. Whatever is happening to you is destined to happen. And as Anne Gleig has been pointing out recently, there are sort of manosphere versions of Buddhism, sort of right-wing versions of Buddhism that are coming out now. So things that we might not expect. So yeah, I mean, there's no way around the fact that we have to use our critical thinking and thinking through and evaluating these things.
Seth, were you raising your hand there for or no, sorry. Okay. Great. I might use in this moment where there isn't a hand up, just use my chair prerogative and throw some comments and a question in the mix. And the first one is really just kind of a comment. It isn't a well-formed thought, but yeah, David, I really found the book helpful for disabusing me of some of my own kind of anachronism around importing some of the sort of affirmative or existential affirmation of a contemporary Tibetan Buddhism that I'm familiar with back into the 2,500 years ago moment where there is a bit more of the sort of world rejecting element that you cover so well in the book, and so it's helpful to for me to, it's never a lovely thing to realize that you're kind of wrong about something in terms of how you've been thinking about it, but it's also sort of liberating to get closer maybe to what how understand of reality or the truth. But we just, I meditated this morning and I do a kind of lineage practice of kind of connecting into to lineage and the different teachers that have led me to be sitting on the seat in this exact moment doing this practice that is, in some respects, as you note in the book, tethered to a 2,500-year history, and in other respects is also quite new in its formation. But I guess there's, in as much as there's a part of me that can sort of feel a bit disabused of the authenticity of the practice in terms of its precise connection back to a 2,500 year sort of moment under the Bodhi tree. There's also just something liberating about realizing that what I am doing is tethered to this long lineage. But as with any lineage, there's these intervention points, there's these contestations, there's these transformations, such that, again, a world rejecting ethos 2,500 years ago, through the different crossings and translations into the Tibetan Buddhist modernism that I'm familiar with, becomes a sort of existential affirming practice, and so it is connected to this 2,500 year history, and yet at the same time, as with all lineage, there's this contestation and change. And so, anyways, just thanking you for helping me come to, I think, a more accurate view that on the one hand feels a little bit uncomfortable, but on the other hand is also liberating. So really appreciate that. So that's really just a comment. But I don't know if you have any thoughts to that before I turn to a question.
Yeah, well, it is sort of interesting how, I mean, sometimes I have a little bit of a sense of trepidation because as an academic, we're sort of raised to believe that nothing we do has any effect on anybody ever. I mean, at least your books, your students is one thing, but like nobody reads academic books. But you know, people have read my Making of Buddhist Modernism, and maybe people are reading this one too. And you know, and I sort of aimed Rethinking Meditation not just at an academic audience, but also at a practitioner audience. And I recognize that some of the things I say will be, you know, maybe a little unsettling and uncomfortable, because I'm looking at it. I'm basically a historian of religion, and so I'm looking at the historical development of these traditions. And whenever you do that, you're sort of uprooting neat stories about how, you know, this particular thing I'm doing just goes right back to the Buddha under the Bodhi tree. And I remember being at a conference once, and somebody telling me jokingly, but sort of half seriously, that the Making of Buddhist Modernism ruined her life. She's okay now, but you know, she really felt like it sort of you know, really called into question everything she was doing. And so, you know, I've become a little more aware that can happen. Um, but yeah, I think in some ways, and I say this in the recent book, I think that spirit of critical inquiry, yeah, it is a part of the Western history of critical thought and inquiry and historical excavation. But I think it really resonates too with Buddhist critical thought. I mean, there's just nobody who can be more like searing than the Buddhists in their critiques, even of their own tradition, right? And nobody who is, you know, more interested in sort of uprooting your fixed ideas about things, again, including Buddhism itself. And so, yeah, I feel as informed by Buddhism in this endeavor as I am by Western thought and the kind of religious studies paradigm and so on.
Well, that's a lovely response, because that actually kind of helps name what I was trying to say, but I don't think was even conscious in my mind, which is that, yeah, I think your book has not only improved my sort of intellectual engagement with Buddhism, but I think it's deepened my practice. Like there's a way that it feels that the sort of destabilization of recognizing some of the discordance, not only resonance between what I'm doing and this ancient practice, is actually there's a Buddhist element to that I really appreciate and find enabling. I see that Shannon has her hand raised. I actually just have a quick question for Seth. I know, Seth, you turned your video off. I'm not sure if you're still available for a question there right now, but I'll maybe come back to you if, yeah, okay, maybe I'll come back to Seth for a question I had for him. So yes, Shannon, please take it away.
Yeah, I wanted to just, you know, that someone said, reading this book ruined my life. I really had this sort of opposite experience where reading that book made me feel like I could be a whole person when I thought about these things, because I am a political theorist, I am a critical theorist, and it was always impossible for me to kind of like sit and meditate without turning that part of myself off, right? Like, and I struggled with it for a long time. Like, I would sit and I would feel conflicts in all of these different ways. And I've used this example before, but I'll just give it again. I would for a year or so, I would go to the San Antonio Zen Center and sit and meditate at like 5 a.m. in the morning. And I had a 2-year-old child at home that whenever I was going there, I was leaving him, and I had to shut off my phone to sit and meditate and not just silence it. There was a big sign that said you had to shut it off entirely. And I was like, I can't do that. Like, this is not built for me. Like, I can't be unreachable in some way if I'm sitting and doing this. And that seemed really wrong and troubling and exclusionary, and it was a vivid kind of experience for me because I wanted to do this thing, but I couldn't. And it got me, reading David's book got me to think, allowed me to be able to think critically about what these spaces allow and don't allow and who they're kind of built for, and some of the kind of power dynamics that are behind that. And it liberated me to be able to find practices that worked for me now at different stages of my life without feeling like I was failing or doing it wrong. And I think like part of what's going on there is David's book, it's not just disenchanting, but that critical perspective enables us to be okay with being a little more creative with our practice. And that's the creative part of it. It's critical, but it's not disenchanting because it enables us to make it, right? To engage in that process of creativity in different ways.
Thanks. I'm glad to know how that landed on you.
Yeah.
Seth, I might circle back just with a clarification question for you. You made a comment that I found really provocative and interesting, and would just love to just hear a little bit more on it. You mentioned the sort of jump from Jung to Fromm in terms of their orientations and descriptions of Buddhism. And I would just love to hear a little bit more about that, not knowing as much about that sort of intellectual history of the psychoanalytic engagement with Buddhism, but why there was such a stark difference between Jung's presentation and then Fromm's more sort of modern take.
Well, I wish I could answer that question. I don't think I know enough about either Jung or Fromm to be able to answer that. I know Jung, for example, lectured for a couple of years at the University of Zurich, standing room only audiences on Tibetan Buddhism. And it's not as if it was D.T. Suzuki had asked him to write the foreword to his book on Zen when it was translated to German. So it's not like he was totally unknowledgeable about it. But clearly what Jung was doing is he was using Buddhism to confirm his own understanding of how the human mind worked. He would look to alchemy, he would look to Buddhism, he would look to all kinds of ancient sources to say, see, they were saying the same thing I'm saying. And I don't think Fromm was trying to do that. I think, Fromm attended Suzuki's lectures at Columbia for a number of years and headed up a big conference in 1957 in Cuernavaca, Mexico, which Suzuki and Karen Horney and there may be about 50 or 60 people attended. But he was really trying to understand the experience. He also practiced Vipassana and wrote a little bit about that as well. He was trying to really understand it. And yes, it fit his larger agenda of how do I undo alienation? How do we connect? How do we recognize that we're parts of society, we're parts of families, we're parts of the natural world, we're not these walled off individuals. So he was trying to understand it in terms of his larger project of how do we undo the alienation of modern society. But he also seems to get it, understand what it is a little bit more than I think Jung did. But I don't know, the book is 65 years old now, and it's remarkable to me to be able to read a book that's 65 years old and say, somebody could have written this book today and it would have used the same language and the same imagery and the same sensibility. It's really quite remarkable in that way.
Great, thank you so much.
The thing that also I remember about I believe it was that Fromm chapter is that he conceives of the experience of Satori in Zen as a complete de-repression, right? So in traditional psychoanalysis, you have some symptom and you're going in deep into the unconscious and try to unearth what issue is there, or what kind of repressed material is leading to that symptom. And for Fromm, this experience of Zen meditation and wrestling with koans and so on eventually sort of completely de-represses a person, so that there's no hidden corners that can produce neurosis. I don't have any.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, I don't know if that's true, but it was a creative sort of adaptation.
Yeah, I'm going to have to excuse myself again for another second. I have somebody ill that I have to take care of. I'll be right back.
Yeah. Great. Well, this panel ends in 10 minutes, and so we have a little bit more time if there's any sort of thoughts or questions or comments that are percolating for people.
Well, it looks like Olga's hand is raised.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, sorry. Go for it, Olga. Thank you.
Here's an interesting thing that I've read and my friends have told me, is that I'm on the autistic spectrum, which is if you're not familiar with it, it's a different brain structure than the neurotypical brain. What I've heard rumors of is normal meditation, such as Buddhism and other sorts of meditation, don't work on the autistic brain, despite autistic people needing the benefits more because they're always stuck in a constant state of anxiety. So yeah, I wonder if you have any ideas on that. Like, do you think there's any books or anything in your book about special type of different meditations that are specifically built for the autistic brain? Or
I have a feeling my co-panelists here would be more equipped to answer that than I would. Buddhism or meditation and autism.
It's a really interesting question. It's not one that I've come across. The short answer is I don't know. But there are conversations in communities with ADHD communities, so non-neurotypical communities, about the ways in which the affordances of ADHD align with jhana meditation. So jhanic practice is kind of concentration meditation, and you concentrate on something and you go into absorptions, these states of absorption, and they're kind of scaled. So I've had interviews with various different people who identify with, have been diagnosed with ADHD, who report that they think that this gives them an advantage in that, so it's easier for them to stay focused and so on. But it's not an area that I've worked on in any detail.
In the chat, somebody said that there's an article in Tricycle about this. So.
Yeah, I this is very prosaic, but just sort of secondhand reading, I have seen some commentary again with ADHD as like mantra meditation as being more generative than the sort of following the breath meditation. But again, don't have a lot of knowledge in that regard. Anita.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, Shannon just put a comment about this too, about just kind of like the broader ecology of practices as possibly also being really pertinent to people who are not neurotypical or don't conceive of their own experience that way. And so embodied practices, movement, etc. But what I was also thinking about is a book that was co-authored by Erin Manning, who's going to be speaking on the third panel, actually called what's it called? Thought in the Act, which is about it's about the ecology of experiences. And there's actually one essay in there that I found that's really useful on issues of autism and non-neurotypical experience that just came to mind in your question.
Wonderful. Okay, well, I think we can perhaps wrap up this lovely discussion. And want to just again thank David for sort of putting his work forward for this critical and generative engagement. And then thank you for again, a wonderful book. And then also big thanks to Joe and Seth for their really generative comments that helped spark a very lively conversation that I know I really benefited from. I'm sure others did as well. So just want to thank you all very much for this engagement.
Thanks very much, guys.
And so in terms of our sort of larger agenda today, we'll take a short break, and we'll be back at 10:30 a.m. for our panel, again, special effects on Shannon Marriotti's contemplative democracy, politics, practice, and pedagogy. And so we'll see you all in just over 15 minutes.
Thanks, everybody. See you in a bit.